I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Energy, oil and gas, the Alberta federal government MOU, war in the Middle East, what's going to be happening to the Canadian economy. There's only one person that we can talk to understand all these things, and that's Heather Exner-Perot, who is a really smart young lady who works with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, specializing in energy, Indigenous relations, and other issues. And she's written and spoken recently about all these issues, so I thought it'd be great to check in with her. Heather, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back, Brian.
Thank you for coming back. So I saw that you were on TV recently. I think you've been commenting. Is what's going to happen to the world economy with the war in Iran, the blockage of the Straits of Hormuz? Is this good for Canada, bad for Canada, good for the world, bad for the world? What's your take?
Very bad for the world. That is very clear. You can look at, the 5 or 6, supply and demand shocks we've had in the last century. None of them good. COVID, Great Recession, the oil embargoes in the 70s, and the IEA saying that this is the worst one ever. So that's not going to be good. Will probably lead to inflation. Will probably lead to, a lot of people going into extreme poverty. We're already seeing impacts on fertilizer. That will soon be impacts on food. We have not felt the impacts yet because we've had enough reserves. You've had enough oil and water that is still making its way to its destinations. That is now slowing down. What left, the Strait of Hormuz at the beginning of the crisis in early March, those have all reached their destinations. We're going to be drawing down, and energy should get more expensive. And even the Trump administration is signaling that this may take weeks or months. What? So very bad for the world, mixed for Canada. And we are one of 3 countries, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Canada, who are perfectly energy secure if you look at rankings. And we are a huge oil exporter. And so there's probably no one but Canada and Russia who stands to come out better on the other side of this. But 198 countries will come out much worse.
Why is the stock market an all-time high?
I don't know. And I'm checking it too, because obviously, I have retirement savings also. And, it's, that stock market just won't stop rising, even with the Trump tariffs, there was usually a pretty quick rebound. And I do think, I would say the consensus among most energy experts, geopolitical experts, is that this is bad and it's going to get worse. And it feels like the market's not pricing in, or people have rebalanced somehow. But feels to me like you should weigh into hard assets and things that are inflation proof is what I would be doing.
So the I don't even know, is it the Treasury Secretary, I think, in the United States that spoke yesterday and said that he thought that, excuse me, the gas prices in the United States would start with a 3 sometime this summer. And it was a very positive outlook as to how quickly the world would sort of get back to normal. And then you hear other people talk about how once some of these refineries are closed, or the oil fields are closed, it takes a long time to get them back up into operation. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, of course. So we know how much production we've lost just from this episode. If it ended today, and there's no way for it to end 100% and get back to normal in a day, we've lost about 1 billion barrels that we would have otherwise had in this world. And now people might not, oil was very cheap before this, about $60 a barrel. There was a glut, there was more production than demand. And so there was excess, and there was a lot of storage, and there was a lot on boats, and there was sanctioned Russian, sanctioned Iranian, sanctioned Venezuelan oil. So there was extra. So there was a little bit of fat, that you could cut into. But now we've, the loss of production has absorbed that. We have 13 million barrels roughly. The world uses about 105 a day. So over 10% of what we would normally produce is offline. And we know that there's been a tax on energy infrastructure. And we know that some LNG facilities, some oil export facilities will be offline for years.
For years.
And so for years. I mean, these are things that are expensive. How long do you think it takes to build LNG Canada? You know what I mean? Like, so if you have to rebuild some trains at a Qatari LNG facility, yeah, it will take years to get the equipment, and it's the equipment, it's supply chain for the equipment. So all this is bad. You already see diesel has been more expensive than gasoline. Diesel is what runs economies. So maybe the consumer and the voter doesn't notice as much, but the farmers and the miners and the truckers notice it for sure. You're already starting to see some mines talking about reducing production, which means that all materials are going to get expensive. You're hearing about farmers not apply as much fertilizer, or foregoing particular kinds of grains and oil seeds, which means food will get more expensive. I just don't see how you unwind this. The only, it's a range of terrible and not terrible, but it's all going to be worse than the baseline of what we had if you had just had January 2026 going on normally.
So getting back to $3 a gallon of gas in the next couple of months over the summer?
No, I mean, I feel like there's no chance. And you have to appreciate the United States is a big producer of oil, but has always been, never was not a net importer of crude. So it does export some crude, but it imports more crude than it exports. So it's a net importer of crude, and it gets a lot of it from Canada, obviously. Now, some of those tankers, you have to appreciate, it takes weeks for tankers to move around the world. It takes a lot of time. The tankers that would have otherwise gone to the Strait of Hormuz and cannot go there have started to make their way to the Gulf of Mexico to fill up with excess American crude. And the Americans have quite a lot of storage and a large strategic petroleum reserve. So they can go gas up at the Gulf of Mexico. But now you'll start to see the drawdown from North America. That before, there wasn't that, it wasn't kind of a normal amount of exports coming and going. Now you're starting to see record exports from the United States, and those tankers are all coming in at a faster pace to fill up there. So now that you're going to have more barrels vacating North America, you will start to see some of that drawdown in North America. And that should make the oil here get more expensive. Again, it's been described, and I think it's a good analogy. There was, an earthquake in the Strait of Hormuz, and you are seeing the shock waves. First you hit all the closest consumers, and then you hit the further ones. You're getting to Asia and Australia, and eventually that shock wave will hit North America. And I don't know why markets are defying it. I guess the markets can be irrational longer than the physical oil market, can be supplied. So I expect this will start to sting a lot more pretty soon.
You mentioned the strategic oil reserve in the United States. If they're selling it out, it's not strategic. It's just surplus that they could sell. And so is that a risk to the United States? Should they do that? And then sort of a connected question. I interviewed Lisa Baton, who's the president CEO of the Canadian Oil and Gas Producers or something like that. She said we should have an oil reserve in Canada. I was surprised that we don't have a strategic oil reserve in Canada. Should we? And should we have built up reserves such that we could sell it at this time? We've got, a strategic maple syrup reserve. Like, why the blank do we have a reserve of maple syrup and not a reserve of oil?
I don't think we should have one because it costs money to store and hold oil. It's expensive. So why does the United States have one? And this goes all back to the 1970s OPEC embargo and the Yom Kippur War, 1973, when you had that first oil crisis. And you hadn't had an oil crisis before that because it's really only after World War II that oil starts to be mainstreamed, in the 50s that people start to buy personal vehicles and oil becomes so important to the economy. And so you have that crisis in the 70s, and the reaction to that, and in 1979 also with the Iranians, the reaction to that is to create the International Energy Agency, which people may be familiar with. But that was why it was created, for primarily oil importers, OECD countries, to coordinate to avoid such a shock. And the condition of being a member in the IEA is that you hold 90 days of oil reserves. But they've always exempted the few oil producers, so Norway, Canada, sometimes Mexico, from having to hold those oil stocks because we are an exporter. We are exporting. We are putting 5 million barrels into the global market every day. We don't need to hold, a million, whatever. It would be, a shadow of what it would compare to actually getting into the market that we're doing anyways. Now, to get, what is in our strategic interest? Why would we? The whole point of a strategic reserve is to reduce the impact of a shock of being dependent on these authoritarian countries. So if someone manipulates it or Russia, nothing happens. Canada shouldn't be reducing the risk and absorbing the cost of other countries being dependent on other bad producers. We should be incenting them to buy Canadian oil and not be subject to those shocks. So why would we reduce the risk for them to buy more oil from the Middle East when we should be encouraging them, just buy it from Canada? We're putting 5 million barrels in a day. We move that up to 7 million. Just get it from us. You won't have a shock. So that's why I think, but mostly, Brian, it's expensive to store oil. And why would we absorb those costs?
Have we ramped up from 5 to 7 million barrels a day? Can we ramp up? Can we ramp up more?
Well, I mean, not in the short term, for sure not, but for sure in a couple of years, absolutely. And I would say there's probably already plans to move up, 1 million barrels in the coming years. I would say, that looks like the pace is about 250,000 a year. And at 100, and that was at $60 a barrel. We were ramping, we were going over 200,000 barrels, adding incrementally at $60 a barrel. And for a lot of these companies, I know, they have a threshold. They would be profitable up to $45 a barrel. They would not be shutting in any production. And so they would advance projects, even anticipating, even in the worst case scenario, went down to, let's say, $45 or $50 a barrel. So you have to wonder, at $80 or $100 a barrel, do they want to ramp up more than 200,000, 250,000 barrels a year? Probably, you know what I mean? There's an incentive for that. And then, of course, Brian, it gets down to, do we have the pipeline egress for them to move that to market? Which is another reason why a reserve would be of no help right now. Our pipelines are pretty full. You see, there's to be no way to move oil from reserves if we did have them in Canada.
Well, you could have the reserves at the coast, I guess. But anyway, what about LNG?
I mean, LNG is doing okay. And obviously, huge interest in Canadian LNG. There was already interest since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. People were already interested in diversification, having different sources of supply. There weren't a lot of great options out of there. Canada was with a preferred option, but slow and expensive. And now finally we had LNG Canada running. We have 2 trains running, so that was great. But there's two other projects under construction. And there's 2 other very big projects just waiting final investment decision. And I think, some of that slowed down with Trump coming and really pressuring Asian allies to buy American LNG. And as a bit of quid pro quo, you'll have a lower tariff if you buy some more LNG. So that slowed down, I think, offtake agreements with Canadian. But now it's picked right back up. This crisis is obviously assigning a premium to Canadian LNG, such that, Brian, yesterday it was revealed that some German buyers and other European buyers are having talks with one of those LNG projects to buy it from the BC West Coast and ship it through the Panama Canal and take offtake agreements from them. So really waiting a much long route, longer costs or bigger costs, but willing to enter into that to have some diversity in their supply.
Does this change the whole idea of a pipeline to the Great Lakes or all the way to the Atlantic coast?
Well, there is a Trans-Canada pipeline that brings natural gas to Eastern Canada. So we do have a pipeline, and it could be optimized. It could be filled. You could do more there. But I do think, Atlantic Canada should just develop its own oil and gas. I don't know why you need to pipe it over from Western Canada. Develop your own, get the royalties out there. And so we are
not doing that. I thought we had a whole bunch of oil rigs off of the coast of Newfoundland.
Well, oil. So Newfoundland has some oil. absolutely before, when you had, the Trudeau policies and the emissions cap, there was no interest in building offshore Newfoundland when there was an emissions cap on. But with that taken off, you had some progress on Bay du Nord. So there is progress in Newfoundland. They are very likely to grow production. They have another Cenovus project that's probably going to come online in the next month or two. But you remember that story about Australia and LNG coming to St. John, New Brunswick, and everyone was wondering, why are we importing LNG from Australia? New Brunswick and Nova Scotia have been producing offshore. That field depleted. That's why they built an import facility in St. John at all. And now northeastern, northern England, northeastern New England in the United States, and the Atlantic, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick were dependent on LNG getting imported. And part of it, they had offshore oil and gas development, and both the federal government and the Nova Scotia government a couple of years ago kind of vetoed some new licenses, said, no, this doesn't meet our Paris Agreement goals. We don't want to have this. And obviously now the tide has turned, and Tim Houston is saying actively, we do want this investment. He was in Calgary this week. He was in Zero Week in Houston 2 weeks ago, actively trying to attract that investment and seeing, the business case, I have to say, for natural gas development in the offshore Atlantic.
So, we could debate the geopolitical situation in the Middle East for a long, long period of time, and lots of people have and will. But I am personally of the belief that nothing's going to be settled in the short to medium term. That it's going to take something the U.S. is not willing to do to completely defeat Iran and win this war. And so therefore we'll end up having a compromise, which will mean that Middle Eastern oil and gas will be at risk for the medium term. Yes. If you thought that there was risk and there was therefore a risk premium to using that, what would we change in our strategy? China gets, what is it, 70%, 80% of their energy from the Strait of Hormuz. We should be selling that to them. What should we be doing?
Well, so we've obviously been in a moment for 15 months since Trump was inaugurated, I would say, of wanting to do things differently in Canada. Carney was elected a year ago on a platform of making Canada an energy superpower. That is a very popular position in Canada. They had the MOU with Alberta. And people will say the talk has been good. The Davos speech was great. We want to be that country that we referred to in Davos, but we aren't that country yet. Investment is still finding its way elsewhere. We are still not building those projects. There's still uncertainty. Oil and gas is still just going to do dividends and shareholder, buybacks instead of investing in Canada. And so now that he has his majority, I would guess you would say, okay, it's the time to, shit or get off the pot. Sorry, I can't think of another expression to use. But there's nothing left in the way to do what you want to do for your agenda. And the biggest impediment now is the industrial carbon price, that we don't know what it will be and what it'll look like. And no one's going to make a final investment decision without knowing what it's going to be. And so that's the purgatory we're in now. But I have to say, we're in the world's biggest supply crisis we've ever had.
World's biggest supply crisis we've ever had.
According to the International Energy Agency, yes, more supply, and as a proportion has been brought offline. The Strait of Hormuz, that is the big kahuna of oil choke points. This is unprecedented. Yes, the biggest supply shock that we've ever had. And if Carney can't find a way to, pave a way for more Canadian oil and gas production now, when our allies, literally Europe, is buying it from the west coast of Canada and shipping it halfway around the world, and obviously Asian partners are obviously much more interested. They're the ones most impacted by this crisis. They're the ones, and depending on Australia for some LNG, Australia has peaked, and they're saying we need to put export restrictions on and windfall profits on LNG. We don't have enough natural gas at home. American crude oil production has probably peaked. Norwegian crude oil and gas production is peaking. Don't we want to have a democracy that is putting some more supply into this depleted market? I would think that we do. And I would think that Carney and Hodgson get calls every day from allies wondering if Canada can be that source.
So if you had a chance to sit down with Hodgson, and I hear very good things about him, if you had a chance to sit down with him, what would you tell him?
Um, he says most of the right things. There's obviously the philosophical difference over the industrial carbon price. And I would say the Canadian product is already the best. I think we should be satisfied with this is what I say, Brian. The Canadian oil and gas industry is a bunch of Boy Scouts, and they're competing against, American cowboys and Russian gangsters, Middle Eastern dictators. And why are we ganging up against the Boy Scouts? Like, let me tell you, you want the Boy Scout oil and gas to get into the market. The LNG is already the lowest GHG intense. If you're making more regulatory and carbon price burdens, you are just displacing that low GHG LNG, and you're letting other competitors with a higher GHG intense product get into the market. Heavy oil is more GHG intense than light oil, but the world needs some refineries require heavy oil. Our competitors for heavy oil are Venezuela and Iraq, and they have a higher intense GHG intense barrel. So if you make it harder to build and invest and produce here, you're just paving the way in the market for more Venezuelan and more Iraqi production. And so you aren't actually doing anything for the environment, but you are making the world less energy secure, and you are giving up that opportunity that Canada has, responsibility that Canada has to provide more supply to its allies.
Okay, not everyone's going to understand what this high GNG is. Explain this to everybody.
Greenhouse gas, high greenhouse gas intensity. So just how much greenhouse gases, climate change gases are in each barrel or in each, ton of LNG that you consume.
And you're saying that Canada's LNG is already the best, the lowest.
It is. Correct.
And our oil.
Hodgson says that too. Hodgson says that. So.
And our oil is not, but it's better than.
But our heavy oil is compared to other heavy oil producers, and some refineries simply require heavy oil, produces different products. Oil seems the same to you and me, but to refinery, they're very different. And they will have to get heavy oil from somewhere else, and they'll get it from Venezuela and Iraq. And that is not ideal.
So what are we going to do? Like, what are we going to do to make changes? We're going to take a break for some messages, and we're going to come back in 2 minutes with our expert, Heather Exner-Perot, to say, she used, the blank or get off the pot, wording. What are we going to do to get off the pot? How are we going to do this? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking about how Canada can become an energy superpower with Heather Exner-Perot, particularly, obviously, given the geopolitical situation that we found ourselves in. And we were talking about this before any attack in Iran, any attack in any conflict in the Middle East, and we thought people were going to solve it then. We thought that the MOU that was signed between Alberta and the federal government was spectacular, and it was going to have some changes. So other than this industrial carbon price, Heather, is there something that's holding us up getting things done?
Well, so there's a few things tied to it. So I'll get to the pipeline, but that people think the MOU is about a pipeline, but it's about a lot more than that. And one of the things was a clean electricity regulations carve out. And the clean electricity regulations brought in by Trudeau basically said no more natural gas generation. You're not going to build new stuff. And the stuff you have now is going to have to be phased out, around 2035. So, there's a data center boom, Brian, and actually that accounted for most of the capital investment in the United States last year. And I read it was a UN report. 80% of the greenfield infrastructure investment in the world last year was for data centers and electricity related to those data centers. So
80% of the capital investment.
That was, I'll put in your chat. That was a UN report. I put it in my paper blackout that I wrote last month, with McDonald Laurence too. Yes, the money in the world, the best capitalized companies in the world, as we know, are those magnificent seven. They're outlaying hundreds of billions of dollars into AI and data centers and electricity for those, and we are not capturing that in Canada whatsoever.
Because of this?
Because we are running out of electricity, because we peaked. Brian, our electricity generation in Canada peaked in 2017. We have produced less electricity every year since 2017. And even though our population has grown, as you know, probably, I don't know, by 6 million people.
Yeah,
And even though
I don't
we're
understand because we got this big, huge extra bill on the electrical bills in Ontario because I thought we created too much capacity in electricity, such that we got to sell it at below market prices to the United States, and they're charging us this extra amount of money. So I don't understand.
well, Ontario is doing reasonably well, maybe not on cost, but on production. But BC and Quebec, certainly Quebec, and you thought of as our big hydro producers and our big exporters, are both net importers of electricity in 2025, Brian. Quebec was a net importer of electricity.
Quebec was a net importer of electricity?
Yes, and so is BC. BC's been a net importer.
They're selling tons to the United States.
They're importing more.
They've got James Bay. They've got.
They're importing more. So look it up. Look it up. Anyways, so we need more electricity, and we're not capturing any of the value of the data center build out because we don't have any cheap available electricity. Now, Alberta and BC happen to have the world's cheapest natural gas and a nice cold climate that makes it more efficient to do cooling. And everyone would love to build and tap into that. But the clean electricity regulations meant that you couldn't. Now, the MOU said we'll carve it out if we agree on an industrial carbon price. If the industrial carbon price doesn't just affect oil sands, it affects every industry in this country that emits, that is the energy intensive or high emitter with smelting, cement, steel. Those are affected too. But in particular, we're missing out on building that. So everyone is hoping that's the easy money. That's the money that's already lined up. I think there's 5 gigawatts in the interconnection queue in the Alberta electricity operator already, waiting for that MOU and that carbon price to figure out if there's a business case in Canada or if they're just going to keep doubling down in Texas. That's literally, are we going to get our AI? Is my chatbot going to be in Montana or North Dakota? Or is my chatbot going to have data from Canada? And so that's a big deal and really under the radar. I mean, we're talking about very potentially, tens of billions of dollars of investment.
Evan Solomon, who's the Minister of AI or something like this, has been talking a lot about data sovereignty and cloud sovereignty and how we want to have all of this AI and data in Canada. How can we possibly do that if we don't have the power and the data centers?
Does Evan Solomon ever talk about energy? Like, how you cannot be an AI minister and you cannot talk about data sovereignty without talking about the electricity that pairs with that. And in the United States, those two sides of the coin are so explicit. And the DOE is investing everything into nuclear. You're going to see coal come back. Sorry, but you are in the United States. And in Canada,
you're going to have coal come back to produce electricity?
Absolutely.
So if it's our natural gas that you say is the cheapest and cleanest versus the US mining more coal and burning it to create electricity to drive data centers, like that's a slam dunk decision, isn't it?
Yes, Brian, it is. It is for me in Calgary. And I'll say, if you read the MOU, I mean, there's a half a page on AI and data centers. It seems like everyone's on the same page, but we don't. But literally, I just interviewed 6 electricity producers, private producers. They operate in Alberta, but all across Canada. They cannot invest until they know what the industrial carbon price is and what the clean electricity regulations are. Obviously, you cannot model a business case without knowing what these two, hugely impactful regulations are going to be on your business. Anyways, then there's the pipeline. And so absolutely, oil price is high. The new normal is going to be higher. It's not going to be $60 anymore. I would say the new normal is $80 when this resolves. It will be higher until this resolves. So these guys are making money hand over fist. There's a ton of global demand to get more supply into market. You could absolutely, if you look at the charts and everything looked great in Canada between 2010 and 2015, a lot of that was the $150 billion that went into oil sands investment and all the manufacturing and all the jobs and all the foreign direct investment that brought. You could have that again. The global conditions for oil and gas are such that you could have that again. But what's holding it back is this industrial carbon price. And again, and the egress. but this is what happened. I had to point this out, Brian. This is what happened. The MOU said, quid pro quo, we will let you build this Northwest Coast oil pipeline if you also do this $20 billion Pathways Alliance carbon capture project. And what was the rational response from the oil and gas industry to a $30 billion pipeline and a $20 billion carbon capture, $50 billion investment, was to say, is there anywhere else we could build pipeline capacity? And the answer was yes. So Enbridge has announced it's going to expand its main line to the United States by about 400,000 barrels. Trans Mountain has said they're going to look to expand their pipeline by 360,000 barrels. And guess what? In the last 4 to 6 weeks, Keystone XL is back online. Permits are being submitted. Open seasons for producers to fill it are being put out. We are going to build Keystone XL before this Northwest Coast oil pipeline that came with the anchor of a $20 billion carbon capture project.
Heather, that makes no sense. That's like repeating the mistake of free trade. We'll become more reliant on the United States all over again, and we're selling oil at below 80% of market prices to the Americans. They're going to refine it, exploit it, and sell it at 100% of market prices out of Houston. Like, why does that make sense? I'm sorry, it's stupid.
It does not make security sense or foreign policy sense. But if you're a producer, you're going with a pipeline that can get built. The market is calling for that oil. They would like to sell another million and a half barrels of oil. The market would easily take it. And there's no line of sight on when a Northwest Coast oil pipeline can get built. And it comes with the heaviest price tags. We made it the riskiest and the most expensive and the most controversial. And the easy money, like water trickling down a stream that went through the path of least resistance. And guess what those wily Americans did? They made Keystone XL the path of least resistance.
That makes no sense. If there's one thing we learned over the course of the last,
Brian, we didn't learn it.
Was that free trade was quick and easy money, but long term it was a mistake. We should have diversified. We shouldn't be as reliant on one customer. And what you're suggesting is we're going to make that mistake all over again and become way too reliant on one customer. And the reason why is because of the regulatory burden in the MOU that says we have to build this carbon capture.
That is absolutely. I wrote a whole article, so everyone can go read the article that I wrote about it in the Hub. I'm pretty disappointed myself. I can't believe we're making this mistake in 2026. And I can't believe, the inroads we made going to Japan, going to India, going to China, the interest that they have in our energy, trying to diversify trade alliances, trying to double our non-US exports, and that we made this terrible fumble of making the biggest project that would deliver the biggest bang for buck and diversify our exports the most and bolster our trade alliances the most. Imagine if we were, imagine if the Northern Gateway was around and all those oil tankers heading to the Gulf of Mexico right now were heading to Prince Rupert or Kitimat. We could have had that. We could have had that line of tankers and all our allies saying, thank you, Canada. Thank you for providing that redundancy and thank you for saving the day. And we gave all that up and we're going to give it up for the next crisis, it looks like, too.
Okay, so if you had a chance to sit down with Tim Hodgson, the Minister of Natural Resources and Energy, what would you tell him?
I would say take off the anchor. I would say have emissions intensity reduction goals. And I have to say, people don't appreciate that the oil sands have been pretty good. Conventional oil has been very good. Oil and gas emissions, the sector emissions peaked in Canada in 2014. I'm going to say that again. The emissions from the oil and gas sector in Canada peaked in 2014. And the value and the production has gone up by at least 1.5 million barrels by then. And so they are doing emissions reduction. They are getting it down. It's not like they're not doing anything. And if the federal government doesn't come with a big, cudgel, that they're not going to do anything. But I always say, I want them to be best. I want them to be the Boy Scouts that are the best. But you can't expect them to be perfect. You can, be better than the next competitor, but not 4 or 5 rungs better than the next competitor, which just means that the money just goes somewhere else. No one is going to pay for being that much better. So I would say don't make the perfect, the enemy of the good. It'd be very good if Canada produced more energy for the world that needs it. And it'd be very good if we used it to diversify our trade alliances and be that country that Carney spoke about in Davos. And don't let this idea of Pathways Alliance and its $20 billion price tag stop us from doing something important in the worst supply oil crisis of our times.
So Carney's got a majority government. He seems to have made this Davos speech, and he's repeated it several times, on his trips around the world and then also across Canada. He's got huge amount of political capital and political support right now across Canada. Why don't you think he would do it?
So obviously it's popular. And I mean, must have been, 40 polls on this subject for the pipeline, for Pacific Northwest Pipeline, for oil and gas. And I haven't seen one where a majority didn't support it, for, probably 2 years. So the public is with him. He's been promising an energy superpower. He ran on energy superpower. He's got the MOU halfway there. And I think the challenge was with some members of his caucus that really don't want, and have expressed that really don't want more oil and gas production. And so
they're more worried about climate change.
Yes.
Even though what you've suggested is climate change is going to get worse because we're going to be still using the same amount of energy, but it's going to be dirty oil from Venezuela and Iraq and coal from the United States, et cetera, and taking it from less democratic countries or undemocratic countries like Russia. So climate change is actually not going to be improved at all, and the geopolitical situation is going to be worse. Like, I don't understand. Why does that make sense?
I absolutely believe everything you just said. That's I don't know, Brian, why that argument doesn't resonate with everybody. And sometimes I'm like, why are you attacking the Canadian Boy Scouts? Why don't you attack some other dirty industry like not here? Why are you attacking Canadian industry? But anyways, we'll see what he does. Again, you could, it's reasonable to say wait for the by-elections, wait for the majority. I could see the political constraints that he has. There's no barriers left in front of him. If he wants to do this, he could do this now, and has the political gift, I would say, of April 2026, having a terrible global, geopolitical era shifting energy crisis. So you don't get a better political timing event than the world's worst oil supply crisis to say, yeah, we need to do things a little bit differently. We're going to move a few things around, and we're going to make it easier to produce more oil.
You said that you're also concerned about mining. Are you also concerned about uranium?
Uranium, not particularly. It might increase the cost of uranium a tiny bit. It's not as volume intense as copper or iron or metallurgical coal, nickel. Those base metals, which are very, volume intense. And so, but uranium is doing well. I think this whole episode will be good for nuclear. Again, it'll be a rational response for a fossil fuel importer to want to diversify. And I think nuclear will look pretty good for energy security and for that baseload power that people want. And Saskatchewan or Canada just recently approved 2 new mines in northern Saskatchewan. They had already been approved by Saskatchewan, but the federal government disapproved it literally like in the last 4 to 6 weeks. And so Cameco has a lot of brownfield. It can produce more. And now we can produce some from these new mines as well.
We've been chatting with Heather Exner-Perot of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, an expert on energy, oil and gas, et cetera, on what should happen. I want to take a break and come back and talk about what the world's going to be like if what she says should happen doesn't happen and the geopolitical situation stays the same or gets worse. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm chatting tonight with Heather Exner-Perot of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a real expert on energy, oil and gas, mining, natural resources, etc., about what's happening in the world today, the Middle East, the blockage in the Strait of Hormuz, and what Canada should be doing. And we've talked just recently in the last section about what Canada could and should do. Heather, I wonder what you could do to paint a picture of what's going to happen to the world if some of the things that you've suggested should happen don't happen? If the Strait of Hormuz stays blocked for a while, what's the logical extension of that?
This is such a great question, Brian, and I think we've been sleeping on the humanitarian crisis that is impending in the world. And you don't have to go far. You can go back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis and the food crisis that precipitated from that to get an idea of the kind of things that happen. And I think there's been 6 or 7 times in the world since World War II that more people went into extreme poverty than came out of extreme poverty. This has overall been a great time to be a human. We figured out a lot of extreme poverty issues. A lot of people have come out of famine and starvation. But 6 or 7 times when it actually has gotten worse, and you can think of, the famine in India in the 60s, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, 2008 financial crisis, 2022 with Russia, and you will see that again in 2026. You'll see more people descend into extreme poverty, and what that means is you are not getting enough calories to survive. That you will slowly starve. That's what it is to be in that status of extreme poverty. You will see that fertilizer is more expensive and diesel is more expensive. Therefore, food production is more expensive and food transportation is more expensive. And the people who already didn't have enough food and already didn't have enough energy will be the ones that bear all the brunt of demand destruction. And what does that mean? The world uses about 105 million barrels a day. We've lost 13 million out of the well that we all share from. That means we have to reduce consumption, that those barrels will have to come from anywhere. We've just heard this week that the Prime Minister said he will be cutting the fuel excise tax in Canada. I expect some provinces will cut fuel taxes if it starts to dig too much. What we are saying is Canada will not bear any brunt of this. We will not have any demand destruction. We can afford it. We have it. We don't need to suffer. We will have our same summer vacations and our same summer drivings. Canadians do not have to be affected by this crisis. But that means that and I think it was a good decision. I mean, it's a logical political decision, but it means that someone else is going to have to bear the brunt of the demand destruction. And we all know it's going to be the people in the world who are the poorest. So very bad, which is to get to your next point. What should we be doing so that this doesn't happen to people again every 5 years, as it seems to be happening? And that is to have diversity of supply and some supply coming from democracies. And I really think that is very important, that not all of our oil comes from the same region and not all of our oil comes from authoritarian regimes. And everyone has seen in the last year and a half how the United States and Trump has been willing to use economic coercion. Whatever leverage they could use, they've used economic coercion. You see China use economic coercion, pushes its trading partners wherever it can, puts on export restrictions, the United States applying tariffs. The more we have nice countries like Canada. I think we're a good place and a nice people, and we're not out to coerce or harm everyone. The more you can have us fulfilling supply, I don't know why anyone would stop that. I don't know why you would make your allies have to go to Russia or the Middle East or the United States, frankly, for more of their supply, knowing that all of those places tend to use it as economic coercion and leverage when they can. And so that is what I am thinking about the next energy shock, which is surely there will be another energy shock, and how to make it a little bit less bad for the people who bear the brunt of these things.
Obviously, a lot more people going into poverty and slowly starving is terrible. But what are some of the other impacts? I believe that you mentioned you think inflation is going to be higher, and that would also mean that interest rates are going to be higher.
And it looks like the bond markets are pricing that in. And I'm a variable mortgage rate holder. So it's kind of like, should you lock in, or am I happy it's variable for now? But the expectation certainly is that inflation will go higher. And it almost has to, regardless of, even if this thing unwound today, which, as I agree with you, it's very hard to unwind these kinds of things. We expected the price of a barrel, the futures contracts for oil. So what people were already saying, okay, I'll pay you this in July and this in August and this in September, already buying some supply. we're all in the 60s ranges in January. If you were buying, September oil in January, you would have been paying $60 a barrel. Now those feature contracts are into the 80s and 90s. So the new normal is going to be $80 for sure as a floor. So already you've increased the price of energy by, what is that? Is that 33%? So you've already done that. So energy is already going to be more expensive now than what it would have been as of January 2026. And I think low gasoline prices, energy was cheap, oil was cheap, gasoline was cheap, is what kept inflation in that range as it was, because we're all feeling it on food and groceries. We're all feeling it in some other consumer goods, but gasoline was keeping that inflation rate overall low. And now it won't be able to play that role. So yeah, I think absolutely the smart money and me thinking about my own mortgage is, is it a bad economy is going to keep the Bank of Canada rates down, but the bond market's going to be high. I think that might be the solution, but everything's going to be trending, I would say, in the upwards direction.
So if you have higher inflation and higher interest rates, do you have a recession?
At least, people remember, Brian, I bet remember that the worst case scenario is stagflation, where your economy is not running hot whatsoever, but your interest rates are. And that was why did we have stagflation in the 70s? That was the energy crisis. That was the oil supply shock. Whereas COVID was a demand shock, a bit of a different beast. Anyways, so that would be pretty grim. Obviously, again, Canada, we take this for granted, but parts of this economy will be running hot. That commodities are going to go up in price. Commodities are becoming more scarce. Energy obviously is a winner. And even just being in a country that has excess energy, that's going to be a rarity. So any kind of energy intensive sector is going to be looking increasingly at Canada. It would be very hard to start an energy intensive business in Europe or South Korea or Japan, coming up this year. And so Canada, I think, will be relatively better off compared to everyone else, especially, if Carney sets the policies to lean into this and allow us to build and have an economy that's doing fairly well.
Well, so the oil and gas business at Alberta might be on fire, but won't the industrial heartland of Ontario and Quebec be hurt with higher inflation and higher interest rates and lack of demand from the rest of the world as they suffer recessions and suffer lower increased poverty?
Yeah, so absolutely fair, Brian, and I do think it will be disproportionately beneficial in Western Canada and disproportionately worse. But you do have the benefit of cheap natural gas. I think we supply 70% of Ontario gas, 98% of Quebec's gas, and our gas prices. And I'm talking about natural gas now. They have not gone up. They stayed pretty flat, pretty cheap, and so you're still going to benefit from cheap Canadian natural gas. The Confederation will benefit from the increased corporate taxes that you get on all these energy sales. And if we do grow, if we start producing more, growing more, there's hundreds of Ontario and Quebec manufacturing facilities that feed into the oil sands. And I think people don't appreciate that, but literally hundreds of companies. And so if you can ramp up the need to produce more steel and to produce more equipment and more manufactured, pieces, heavy equipment in Alberta, that, they have to buy it from somewhere. We don't produce a lot of that here in Alberta. We don't do a ton of manufacturing. They would be wanting, and the supply chain already exists. That is where they get those materials from.
So I guess that's if we lean into this the way you described it. But if we don't, my question was, if we don't take the actions that you're talking about, what happens? I worry that if you don't have that increased manufacturing in Ontario. You've got the higher inflation, you've got the higher interest rate, you've got maybe stagflation, you've got a recession elsewhere in the world because of all the reasons that you've mentioned. And not again in Calgary where you are, but in Toronto where I am, you've got a housing sector that is in a deep freeze right now. And given everything I've just described, doesn't the housing sector become even worse?
Well, I think so. So if Canada is standing out as one of the few major economies that is doing well, that is hiring, that is attracting investment, then you'll have more people working and more people with jobs and more people who need housing. You know what I mean? Like, whereas, we're getting to the point with gas prices go above, I think there's a psychological milestone at $2 a liter, where even if that, only adds, let's say, $50 to your monthly costs, depending on how much you drive, psychologically, you feel life is more unaffordable. And all of a sudden, I can't afford everything. I feel constrained. I'm not going to buy those new clothes. I'm not going to get that new house. I'm not going to get that new car. And that's where it starts to impact every sector of the economy, when that consumer confidence goes down because everything feels unaffordable. But if we can be raking in the export revenue, raking in the corporate taxes, raking in the royalties, creating jobs, producing more, being a bright spot in the global economy, then you have consumer confidence. And people are looking at, able to make longer term plans, able to make longer term purchases. So yes, we have this opportunity in front of us. And I would be so shocked and bewildered if we don't take advantage of it.
So I guess the point that you're making, that I'm trying to get you to make, is that, number one, this is the right thing to do geopolitically. This is the right thing to do for the oil and gas sector in Alberta, but it's actually the right thing to do for people that are at risk in Ontario and Quebec, because that's going to be what's the energy behind our economy. And if we don't do it, we're going to suffer some of the fate that you've regrettably described the rest of the world is going to suffer, particularly the most impoverished people in the world. And we have an opportunity to not only become an energy superpower, but to super energize our economy.
We do. We have those options. I always say, Canada has our problems, but there's 200 countries in the world that wish they had our problems. And they have a lot worse problems. And all of our problems are of our own making. And honestly, policy is the sand in the gears right now. And policy should be making the gears go faster. And we're all waiting and anticipating and hoping that a Carney majority can do that.
Is Danielle Smith doing the right things right now? If you were chatting with her, what would you tell her to do?
I mean, Danielle Smith and Mark Carney seem like they genuinely have a good relationship. You've heard no sniping, no backstabbing between those two camps. The message consistently is we are working constructively together. And I have to say, if anything, Danielle Smith is ahead of her UCP base and the UCP caucus on how close she is to Carney and what Carney has delivered so far. So she's optimistic. She's quelling all the anxiety, trying her best in Alberta. And I hope they can deliver, because she's a little bit out on a limb on this relationship with Ottawa right now.
If you were advising a CEO of a major oil and gas company in Calgary, what would you be telling them to do?
So you have heard the oil and gas sector in the last week become more vocal and more detailed and more persistent in what they want to see from all of this, and much more frank, I would say. And I think they are feeling as though they have more leverage, that actually Carney needs to be an energy superpower. Carney needs them to invest. Carney needs to pave a way for them to be that engine of the Canadian economy right now. And therefore, I think they feel emboldened to be specific in what it would take to get them to spend the most and grow the most in this country.
So let's summarize. So number one, we got to get rid of the industrial carbon tax, correct?
They are saying they want to get rid of it. Even I wouldn't go that far. And I don't know, maybe it's it's all cost. That is true. I think Alberta has had an industrial carbon pricing system since 2007. I think you could manage it pretty well. I don't think Alberta should get rid of its whole system. But we certainly don't want the federal government and Environment and Climate Change Canada to maximize it, kind of with the kind of few Justin Trudeau stalwarts that are still left there and what their vision for it is. For sure not.
Number two, we got to get rid of this carbon capture obligation within the MOU.
Yes, and I'll say it's that particular project, which is a $20 billion major project and a bit of a white elephant, which isn't to say that we shouldn't spend money on emissions reduction. But that one big white elephant project with a huge upfront price tag is a very expensive way to do it. And I just think that there are more efficient ways to reduce emissions, and we should encourage those, and we should look for, to be the best in the world and to improve our rankings and how we stack up. But I don't think requiring that one big $20 billion price tag is in the best interest of the Canadian economy right now.
And number 3, we should build the pipeline to the West Coast and not Keystone Pipeline?
It's not that I don't want Keystone. I just wish we had done the Northwest Coast Oil Pipeline first, and so I still want it first. Yeah, I don't see a pathway forward for that happening, but I'll lament that for the rest of my days that we didn't build that damn pipeline in 2 years. It's not. There's no way it's going to happen. I've lost hope.
What would give you the hope? How could you change it? I think it's
I would
critical.
just say, the best case scenario for me now is that we build that thing in that's built and operating by 2032. I think, that's very reasonable, and I think it can happen. I think it probably will happen. It's just that, for 5 or 6 years, we're just going to keep doubling down on the United States.
And would you therefore build Keystone XL?
It's private proponent. They're going to build it. This isn't, everyone's like, oh, well, private proponents aren't interested. No, they're not interested in that $30 billion pipeline that David Eby is against that has a $20 billion carbon capture attached to it. Private proponents are building pipelines in Canada. They're just not doing those hard, difficult, politically contentious, risky, expensive ones.
Heather Ashton-Perot, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate the role you're playing in challenging the sector, the people, the governments of Canada to become an energy superpower, because I think you got the right strategy. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, even from Calgary. And all my podcasts and my videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, as soon as the radio show gets broadcast here. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much, Heather.